Hey, welcome to Mind Explained, where stories come alive. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a restaurant when a powerful man walks through the door. Not the silence of shock. Not the silence of fear. The silence of a room rearranging itself, women straightening their backs, men checking their phones, waiters suddenly finding purpose in wiping already clean tables. It is the silence of recognition. That is the kind of room Adrian Cole walked into on a Tuesday night in early October, in a small coastal city just south of San Francisco, California. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, tall, with the kind of face that cameras had always loved and voters had always trusted. The press had called him California's Golden Mayor. They wrote that he had the smile of a film actor and the record of a statesman. For 6 years, he had governed with quiet confidence. He had cleaned up the waterfront. He had lowered unemployment. He had stood at podiums and made people believe in something again. And yet, on this particular Tuesday night, he sat alone at a corner table by the window, in a navy blazer, no tie, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the rain slide down the glass like it had somewhere important to be. The cameras were not there. The advisors were not there. His wife was not there. He was just a man in a restaurant, trying to remember the last time he had felt like himself. He never expected what was about to happen to him. None of us ever do. Her name was Cassidy Lane. She was 39 years old. She stood near the entrance in a simple black uniform, holding a leather menu against her chest, watching the rain the same way he was. When she finally looked up and noticed him waiting, she did not gasp. She did not whisper to the other staff. She simply walked over, tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and said the 7 words that would quietly change both their lives forever. "Table for one, or are you still deciding?" He paused. Then he smiled, not the practiced smile of campaign photos. A smaller one. An honest one. "Still deciding," he said. "About a lot of things." She looked at him for exactly 1 second longer than she needed to. Then she led him to a table by the window. And that was where it began. Not with fireworks. Not with a dramatic declaration. But with a woman who looked at the most admired man in the county as if she could see past every polished surface, all the way down to the part of him that was tired of pretending. What followed would become one of the most quietly devastating stories California politics had ever produced. Not because it involved corruption. Not because laws were broken. But because it exposed something far more human, and far more uncomfortable, than any scandal involving money or power ever could. It exposed what happens when loneliness finds loneliness. When two people who have spent years holding themselves together finally crack open at the same moment. And what it costs everyone around them when they do. Stay with me. Because this story is not really about politics. It never was. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever watched someone from the outside? Someone who appeared to have everything, and thought, quietly, to yourself, but are they actually happy? Have you ever looked at a person surrounded by applause and cameras and perfectly ironed suits and wondered what their 2 a.m. looks like? What they think about when the room goes quiet? Because that is the question at the center of this story. Not, did the mayor make a mistake? Not, who was to blame? But something much harder. Much more honest. What happens when a man who has everything realizes that everything is not the same thing as enough? And Cassidy, what about her? She was not famous. She was not wealthy. She had no particular reason to be caught up in the orbit of a man like Adrian Cole. And yet something happened between them that neither of them fully understood until it was too late to pretend otherwise. What did she see in him that his own wife no longer looked for? Why, after years of protecting herself from exactly this kind of heartbreak, did she let down her guard for a man who could not offer her a single safe thing? And the wife, Diane Cole, what did she know, and when? What does a woman do when she realizes the man sleeping beside her has already emotionally moved somewhere she cannot follow? These are not comfortable questions. But they are real ones. And by the time this story ends, I think you will find yourself asking which one you would have been. The man who stayed too long in the wrong life. The woman who offered him a glimpse of something real. Or the wife who already knew the answer before anyone said a word. Adrian Cole was born in Sacramento in 1971, the second son of a civil engineer father and a schoolteacher mother who believed, deeply and without irony, that public service was the highest form of citizenship. He grew up in a house where dinner conversations were about zoning laws and school board elections, where the local newspaper was read aloud at the breakfast table, where the phrase, "You can always do more for your community," was said so often it stopped feeling like a statement and started feeling like weather, constant, surrounding, inescapable. He was a gifted student. Not brilliant in the way that isolates people, but gifted in the way that draws them, the kind of student teachers remembered, the kind of young man neighbors pointed to when they wanted to explain what potential looked like. He studied political science at Berkeley, went to law school, and came back to his region with a plan that felt both ambitious and sincere: to serve. To actually do something with the advantages he had been given. At 29, he won a seat on the city council. At 37, he ran for mayor and won with 61% of the vote. The editorial boards called him a breath of fresh air. The state party called him one to watch. Women sent letters to his office admiring the color of his eyes. Men at his fundraisers shook his hand a little too hard, the way men do when they want some of someone else's certainty to rub off on them. He married Diane Harmon when he was 34. She was an architect, elegant, serious, deeply intelligent, with a dry humor that could make a whole dinner table laugh without her raising her voice. They were, for a long time, genuinely good together. They shared a love of early morning runs along the coast. They disagreed loudly and affectionately about wine. They built a life that was not just presentable, it was real. But real things change. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that are almost impossible to name until years have passed and you look back and try to identify the exact moment the warmth began to fade. It was not one thing. It was never one thing. It was the years of campaigns that required Adrian to be publicly generous while privately exhausted. The nights Diane fell asleep waiting for him and stopped waiting eventually. The conversations that became logistics. The affection that became habit. The habit that became performance. And then even the performance dropped away, and what was left was two people who shared a home, a history, and almost nothing else. By the year he met Cassidy Lane, Adrian Cole had not been truly seen by another person in a very long time. He had been admired. He had been photographed. He had been praised and criticized and analyzed. But no one had looked at him recently as though they were genuinely curious about what was happening inside him. No one had asked him, in a long time, what he actually wanted. And Diane, it would be unfair and dishonest to paint her as the villain in this story. She was not indifferent. She was not cold. She was a woman who had built a partnership with a man and watched that partnership slowly become something neither of them had signed up for. She had tried, in her own way, to reach back across the distance. But some distances, once established, develop a gravity of their own. They pull. And eventually, rather than spending all your energy fighting the pull, you simply adjust. She had adjusted. And so had he. Just in very different directions. Now, Cassidy Lane. She grew up in Fresno, the oldest of 3 girls, in a house that was always slightly too small and never quite warm enough in winter. Her father worked freight logistics. Her mother cleaned offices. They were not poor in the way that makes the news, but they were the kind of poor that teaches you, early, that things can be taken away without warning, and that it is better not to need too much, because needing too much is the fastest route to disappointment. Cassidy was 22 when she fell in love with a man named Joel, who had rough hands and a beautiful laugh and a dream about opening a food truck along the coast. She believed in that dream completely, the way you can only believe in things when you are young enough to think belief is the same thing as insurance. They saved money together. They planned routes. They tasted recipes in her tiny kitchen at midnight and argued about whether the guacamole needed more lime. She was happy. The uncomplicated, embarrassing, full-throated kind of happy that you only recognize as what it was after it's gone. Joel was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition when he was 25. The medical bills were enormous. The savings disappeared. The food truck dream folded quietly, like a piece of paper. And 18 months later, just when they thought they might have turned a corner, Joel died in a hospital room at Stanford Medical Center on a Thursday afternoon in March, while the sun outside was doing something cruel and beautiful with the light through the windows. Cassidy was 26 years old. She handled the grief the way practical people handle overwhelming things. She kept moving. She found work. She sent money home to her parents. She did not let herself cry in public, which meant she cried alone instead, late at night, into a pillow she eventually had to replace because it held too much of one particular feeling. By the time she was 39, she had been working at Harborview Restaurant for 4 years. Head hostess. Reliable. Precise. Warm with guests but careful to keep herself at a certain distance. She had dated since Joel, but nothing had taken root. She told herself she preferred it that way. She told herself she was not lonely. She told herself the restaurant was enough, the familiar rhythm of it, the way it absorbed her attention, the way she could disappear into the logistics of other people's evenings without having to think too hard about her own. And then one Tuesday night in October, a man in a navy blazer sat down at a table by the window, and looked at the rain, and she looked at the rain too, and something in the air changed so slightly that she almost didn't notice. Almost. He came back the following Thursday. Then the Thursday after that. At first, the staff simply assumed the mayor enjoyed the restaurant. He tipped well. He never made scenes. He ordered the pan-seared salmon and always asked for extra lemon on the side. By the third visit, Frank, the night manager, had started reserving him the corner table by the window without being asked. But it was Cassidy who noticed the other things. The way he always arrived slightly early and sat with his coat still on for several minutes before removing it, as if part of him was always prepared to leave. The way he never checked his phone at the table, which was unusual for powerful men. They always checked their phones. The way he watched the other diners with an expression that was not envy exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. Their conversations began small, the way they have to. Weather. Local news. A brief argument about whether the new waterfront development was an improvement or a disaster. He thought it was complicated, she thought it was mostly a disaster, and he laughed in a way that suggested he agreed more than he was willing to say publicly. The laugh surprised her. It was too genuine for a man in his position. Most people in power learn to manage their laughter, to deploy it strategically, to modulate it for the room. His just arrived, unannounced, like an honest reaction rather than a performance. She started paying attention to him. Not in the way one pays attention to a person of status, carefully, deferentially, with one eye always on what they might want. In the way one pays attention to something that does not quite fit the category you have placed it in. She found herself curious. And curiosity, for a woman who had spent years carefully not being curious about people, was a warning she did not heed. One evening in late November, 6 weeks after his first visit, the kitchen ran slow and the restaurant emptied earlier than usual. Cassidy was resetting a table near his corner when he spoke without her approaching. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She straightened. "You can ask. How do you do it?" She looked at him. "Do what, exactly?" He gestured vaguely at the room. At the empty chairs. At the door through which the last guests had recently departed. Make people feel welcome. Like they belong somewhere. Even for just a few hours. He paused. "I've watched you work. You never seem to be performing it. It seems like you actually mean it." She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant hummed around them, distant kitchen sounds, the low murmur of the bar. Then she said, "I think people can always tell when they're being managed versus when they're actually being seen. So I try to actually see them. Even if it's only for 30 seconds. Even if I'll never know their name after they leave." He looked at her for a long moment. "I used to know how to do that," he said. "I don't think I do anymore." She didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say to that. So she said the honest thing instead, "Maybe you stopped letting people look back." He went very still. She picked up the menus she'd been reordering and walked back toward the host station. She did not look back. But she felt his eyes following her, and she felt something else too, something she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific, slightly dizzying sensation of having said something true to someone who needed to hear it. He came back 4 more times in December. By January, they had fallen into something that neither of them had named because naming it would have required them to look at it directly, and they were both, in their different ways, afraid of what they would see. He told her things. About the campaign. About the loneliness of public life, the way everyone wanted something from you, always, so that even generosity began to feel transactional. About the years he had spent being good at his job and less good at his own life. He told her about Diane, not to make her complicit, but because the truth of it was pressing against him from the inside and he had no one else to say it to. He said, "We don't hate each other. That would be simpler. We're just two people who have quietly become strangers while living in the same house." Cassidy listened. She didn't offer solutions. She didn't tell him what to do. She had learned, from the years after Joel, that the most useful thing you can offer a grieving person, and loneliness is its own kind of grief, is not advice. It is simply the willingness to sit with them in it. She told him about Joel. She had not spoken about Joel to anyone new in years. The telling felt strange, like opening a room she had kept locked and discovering that the air inside was still breathable. She told him about the food truck dream. About the hospital. About the Thursday afternoon in March with the terrible, beautiful light. He listened the way she had listened. Without solutions. Just with attention. "Do you still think about him?" he asked, one evening in late January. "Every day," she said. "But differently now. More like a fact about myself than a wound. Like knowing which direction north is." He nodded slowly. "I haven't loved anything that honestly in a long time," he said. And that was the sentence that crossed the line. Not because anything physical had happened. But because it was an admission. A reaching across the space between two people who had been pretending, very effectively, that they were simply acquaintances. The following week, someone photographed them. It was raining, the kind of coastal rain that arrives sideways, and the restaurant window was fogged at the edges. The photo showed the two of them at the corner table, leaning slightly toward each other, his hand near hers on the table. Not touching. But near. The photo appeared on a local political blog the following Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 regional news outlets. By Wednesday, it was everywhere. The caption on one site read, "Mayor Cole's Cozy Corner. Who is the mystery hostess?" And just like that, what had been private became public. What had been fragile became a target. And two people who had been trying, quietly and imperfectly, to understand what they meant to each other, suddenly had to do it while the entire county watched. If this story already has you feeling something, drop a comment below. Are you Team Cassidy? Team Diane? Or do you understand Adrian more than you want to admit? Let us know. And don't go anywhere, the hardest part of this story is still coming. The thing about scandals, the thing people forget when they are watching them from the outside, is that they do not feel like scandals from the inside. From the inside, they feel like ordinary life suddenly moving at the wrong speed. Too fast to process. Too public to grieve. Adrian's political director, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Donna Reyes, called him at 6 in the morning the day after the photo circulated. She did not raise her voice. She did not panic. She simply said, "We need to talk about the hostess." And the word hostess, the way she said it, clinically, carefully, as though it were a variable to be managed rather than a person with a name and a history and a dead boyfriend she still loved, that word landed on him like a stone. "Her name is Cassidy," he said. A pause. "I understand that," said Donna. "But right now, she is a photograph. And a photograph can either become a story we control, or a story that controls us. Which one it becomes depends entirely on what you do in the next 48 hours. Donna wanted a statement. Clarification. Distance. The narrative of two professionals who occasionally dined in the same establishment. Nothing untoward. Nothing to see here. The kind of statement that politicians issue when they want to say something without saying anything. Adrian said he needed 24 hours. Donna said he had 12. He called Cassidy from his car. She had already seen the photo. She sounded calm in a way that told him she had been awake since before the photo appeared, which meant some part of her had been bracing for this, or something like it, for longer than either of them had admitted. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't take the photo," she said. "I know. I'm sorry for the other things." She was quiet. Then, "What are the other things, Adrian? Say them out loud. Because I think you need to hear yourself say them." He gripped the steering wheel. He was parked on a cliff road above the ocean, which was doing what the ocean always does regardless of human drama, moving, endlessly, indifferently, with tremendous force and no opinion whatsoever. "I think I've been using our conversations to avoid my own life," he said. "And I think that was unfair to you. And I think I care about you in a way that isn't simple. And I don't know what to do with any of that." "That's more honest than I expected," she said. "Then, Adrian, you have a wife. And a career. And a city that voted for you. I don't fit anywhere in that picture." "Maybe the picture needs to change," he said. A long silence. She said, That's not a decision you make at 6 in the morning in a parked car above the ocean. That's a decision you make after a lot of hard conversations with your wife, your therapist, and yourself. In that order. Not because of me. Not for me. For you. Because you deserve to stop pretending. Another silence. And so does she. That afternoon, Adrian went home. Diane was in the kitchen when he arrived, standing at the counter with coffee she wasn't drinking, looking out at the backyard. She had read the stories. She had seen the photo. She turned when she heard him come in, and her expression was not what he expected. It was not rage. It was not devastation. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. It was the expression of a person who had been waiting for confirmation of something they already suspected, and had now received it, and was in the process of deciding what to do with the confirmation. "Tell me the truth," she said. Not the version for the press release. The actual truth. He sat down at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment. And then he told her. Not everything. Some things resist words, and some truths are too layered to be delivered cleanly. But enough. The loneliness. The months of feeling invisible inside his own life. The evenings at Harborview. The conversations with Cassidy. The way those conversations had slowly become the most real part of his week without his fully acknowledging why. Diane listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her coffee. She looked at him the way you look at a map when you realize you have been reading it upside down for a very long time. "How long have you been this unhappy?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "Long enough that I stopped registering it as unhappiness. I just thought it was what life felt like." "I thought the same thing," she said quietly. And there it was. The most painful thing in the room, not that he had developed feelings for someone else, but that they had both been lonely together for years, and neither of them had known how to say it to the other. Meanwhile, across the city, Cassidy was living through something entirely different. She had not asked for this. She had not pursued a married politician. She had not, in any conscious way, crossed a line. And yet here she was, her name on news sites she had never heard of, strangers commenting on her appearance and her character and her motives with the casual cruelty that anonymity enables. Co-workers who had been friendly now avoided her eyes. Frank, the night manager, pulled her aside and told her with genuine regret that the restaurant's ownership had asked her to take a temporary leave of absence while things settled down. She went home to her apartment, the small one she had lived in for 5 years, with the good light in the mornings and the leaky faucet she had never quite gotten around to reporting, and she sat on her couch and she thought about Joel. She thought about how, after he died, she had promised herself she would not make herself vulnerable in ways that could lead back to this exact feeling. This feeling of being seen by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Of being reduced to a category. Of being a headline rather than a person. She picked up her phone. She looked at Adrian's number. She didn't call. Instead, she called her sister in Fresno, who said, "Come home for a while." And for the first time in years, Cassidy thought, maybe. The press continued. More photos were unearthed, all of them innocent, all of them capable of being made to look otherwise with the right caption. Political opponents began making statements about the mayor's judgment and character. A city council member who had long disliked Adrian issued a formal request for an investigation into whether any public resources had been misused. They had not been, and everyone involved knew they had not been, but the request served its purpose. It kept the story alive and gave it a bureaucratic legitimacy it wouldn't have had otherwise. Adrian's approval ratings dropped 11 points in 2 weeks. Donna Reyes was on the phone with him 3 times a day. His fundraisers began calling to check in, which in political language means, "We are recalculating our investment." The governor's office, which had previously made noises about Adrian being a strong candidate for a statewide role in the next election cycle, went conspicuously silent. And Adrian, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, found that he did not particularly care about any of it. Not in the way he felt he should care. Not in the way he had always cared before, reflexively, instinctively, the way a person cares about the weather when they have somewhere important to be. The approval ratings and the fundraisers and the governor's silence felt like problems happening to a version of himself he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to be. That realization terrified him more than any of the press coverage. 3 weeks after the photo circulated, Diane Cole asked Adrian to sit with her in the living room, not the kitchen, where their difficult conversations usually happened, but the living room, with its built-in bookshelves and the wedding portrait she had never quite gotten around to moving to a less prominent wall. She had a glass of red wine. He had nothing. They sat across from each other in the armchairs they had each separately claimed over the years, and she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." He nodded. "I knew," she said. "Not about her specifically. But I knew something had shifted in you, months ago. Maybe longer. I noticed the Thursdays. I noticed the way you came home from the restaurant, not happy exactly, but lighter. Like you'd set something down for a few hours." She looked at her glass. "I told myself it was just the food. The break from everything. I told myself a lot of things because I wasn't ready to look at what I actually knew." "Diane. Let me finish." She looked up at him. "I've been thinking about why I didn't say anything. And the honest answer is that I was afraid that if I named it, I would have to name everything else too. Including the fact that I haven't been fully present in this marriage in a long time either. Including the fact that I stopped fighting for us before you did. I just fought differently, by not fighting at all. By pretending that routine was the same thing as connection." She took a breath. "I don't say that to excuse anything. But I want you to understand that I don't think this is only about a hostess and a photograph. I think this is about two people who loved each other genuinely, and then let the life they built become more important than the people living it." The room was very quiet. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to be honest," she said. "For probably the first time in years. I think we should separate. Not because of her. Because of us. Because we have been strangers who share a bed for long enough, and I don't think either of us deserves to continue that way." He absorbed that. The strange thing, the thing he had not expected, was that it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a door. "I think you're right," he said quietly. Diane nodded. She looked, for a moment, like a woman who had just set down something enormously heavy. "I want you to know something," she said. "Whatever you decide to do with the rest of your life, professionally, personally, I genuinely hope you do it as yourself. Not as the version of yourself you think you're supposed to be. Because that version has been very impressive. And also very lonely." He couldn't speak for a moment. He looked at the wedding portrait on the shelf. Two people, young and certain, standing in morning light. He felt a grief that was specific and real, not for the loss of the marriage, but for all the years inside it when it might have been different, if both of them had been braver about telling the truth. Now here is the part of the story that no one anticipated. Not the press. Not the political commentators. Not the people following the story in real time from their own complicated living rooms. 10 days after Adrian and Diane's conversation, 3 days before Adrian planned to contact Cassidy, Cassidy left. She cleared her apartment. She donated most of her furniture to a young couple down the hall who had just moved in together. She packed 2 suitcases and a box of books. She left the leaky faucet for the landlord to finally fix. And on a Sunday morning in February, she drove south along the coast until the city disappeared in her rearview mirror, and kept driving. She left a note. Not for the press. Not for the restaurant. For him. She asked Frank to pass it along, which he did, with the quiet discretion of a man who understood more than he said. The note said, "Adrian, you are a good person who has spent a very long time being a great public figure. I hope that one day you find out what the difference is. I am not the reason to change your life. That reason has to live inside you, or it will not hold. Thank you for the conversations. Thank you for listening to me talk about Joel. I had forgotten how good it feels to say his name out loud to someone who is actually listening. Please take care of yourself. Not the you that gives speeches. The other one. C." He read it standing in his office, in his suit, 20 minutes before a city council meeting. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to his chest, where it remained for the rest of the day. He did not know where she had gone. He did not reach out through official channels or unofficial ones. He understood, in the way you understand things that hurt, that she had given him a gift by leaving. She had removed herself as the distraction so he could see what was actually there, the question of who he was and who he still wanted to become, clearly and without the interference of longing. And that was the moment, though he did not fully recognize it yet, when Adrian Cole began to change. He did not resign immediately. That would have been dramatic, and Adrian had grown suspicious of his own dramatic impulses. He served out the remainder of his term, 8 months, with a steadiness that surprised even his critics. He completed the waterfront project. He pushed through a housing initiative he had been too cautious to fully champion before. He showed up to city council meetings and did the work, quietly, without the performance. People who had worked closely with him said something had shifted in him. That he listened differently. That he asked questions he would not have asked before. That he seemed, in some fundamental way, more present. He and Diane separated formally and without drama. They released a brief joint statement that contained none of the usual language about remaining friends or mutual respect, which in political separations is often code for mutual bitterness carefully managed for public consumption. It simply said that they had reached a decision together, that they wished each other well, and that they asked for privacy. It was the most honest public communication Adrian had released in 6 years. When his term ended, he did not run again. He announced his decision at a press conference that was smaller than the ones he had grown accustomed to, no confetti, no campaign music, no carefully selected crowd. Just a podium, a few journalists, and a statement he had written himself, without help from Donna Reyes or anyone else, in longhand, in his kitchen on a Sunday morning. He said, "I have been privileged to serve this city. I intend to spend some time learning how to serve myself with the same honesty I tried to bring to this work. I am grateful. I am finished. Thank you." The reporters had questions. He answered too. Then he walked off the podium and did not look back. That afternoon, he drove south. Not with a plan. Not with a destination entered into a navigation app. Just with a tank of gas and the particular sensation of a man who has finally stopped running from the one direction he needed to go, inward. He drove for 4 hours. He passed towns he had never stopped in. He bought coffee at a gas station and drank it in the parking lot, watching seagulls fight over someone's discarded French fries with the serious, focused energy of creatures who are always entirely present in whatever they are doing. He thought about Cassidy's note. He thought about Diane's words in the living room. He thought about what it had felt like, in those early months at Harborview, to be looked at as though he were simply a person rather than a position. He thought about how rare that is. How rare it should not be. How much of his adult life he had spent optimizing for outcomes and managing perceptions and projecting confidence, and how little of it he had spent simply being honest about what he was and what he needed. He thought, there is still time. That thought, small, precarious, completely unguaranteed, felt more like hope than anything he had experienced in a very long while. 7 months later, on a morning in September when the fog was still low over the water and the bakeries on the coast road were just beginning to light up their windows, he turned off a highway he had driven many times and found a town he had never fully noticed. A small, quiet place. The kind of town that exists to house its own people rather than to attract visitors. There was a bakery on the main street. Small. New. A hand-lettered sign in the window that said, simply, open. He could smell bread from outside. Cardamom and coffee and something warmer underneath that he couldn't name. He pushed open the door. She was behind the counter, flower on her wrist, her dark hair pulled back, speaking to an older woman about whether the lemon bars would be ready by noon. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. She went very still when she saw who it was. The older woman, sensing something, quietly collected her bag and left. The bakery was silent for a moment. Morning light came through the window sideways, the way morning light does when it is trying to be honest about the hour. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them, for a moment, said anything. Because some silences are not the absence of words. They are the presence of too many words arriving simultaneously, and the understanding that none of them, individually, will be quite enough. Then she said, "You look different." "I feel different," he said. "Good different or just different?" He thought about it. "Smaller," he said. "In a way that feels bigger, if that makes any sense." She tilted her head slightly. Then she almost smiled. "It makes sense," she said. "I didn't come here with an agenda," he said. "I don't have a plan. I needed to see that you were all right. And I wanted to tell you that your note helped me more than I can explain." She set down the cloth she'd been holding. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Getting there," he said. "It turns out, getting there, is most of the work." She nodded slowly. Then she reached for a coffee cup. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make you something." He sat at the small wooden table by the window. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. A child was walking a very old dog along the sidewalk with great seriousness. A delivery truck was parking imperfectly in front of the hardware store across the road. Life was continuing in all its ordinary, unheroic, completely beautiful ways. She set a cup of coffee in front of him, and a small pastry he hadn't seen on any menu. "What's this?" he asked. "Cardamom roll," she said. "Joel's recipe. I finally started making them." He looked up at her. "I figured he'd want me to," she said simply. He picked up the coffee. She went back to her counter. The morning continued. Nothing dramatic happened. No declarations were made. No promises. No guarantees. Just two people, middle-aged, honest, complicated, still learning, sitting in the same space at the same time without pretending to be something other than what they were. And outside, the fog kept lifting, the way it always does, eventually. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Not a verdict. Not a judgment. But a question that I think lives somewhere very close to the center of all of us, if we are willing to be honest about it. How much of your life is actually yours? How much of it was built according to other people's expectations, your families, your communities, the version of yourself you decided to present to the world at 22 and never fully revised? How many of us are living, right now, in the middle of a life that is impressive from the outside and quietly suffocating from the inside, and simply haven't found the language yet to say so out loud? Adrian Cole was not a villain in this story. He was a man who had built a life around performance and run out of the energy to keep performing. His mistake was not feeling what he felt. Feelings are not moral failures. His mistake was waiting too long to be honest, with his wife, with himself, and perhaps most painfully, with the woman who reminded him what honesty felt like. Diane was not a victim. She was a partner in a silence they had both maintained. Her courage, in the end, was the courage of naming the thing neither of them had been willing to name, and in doing so, giving both of them the chance to begin again. And Cassidy, who had already learned the hard way that love is not something you can insure against loss. Who had buried a man she loved and rebuilt herself from the pieces. Who recognized something in Adrian that she was wise enough to see clearly and honest enough not to pretend she didn't see. She walked away not because she didn't care, but because she understood, better than most, what it costs to build something on a foundation that isn't ready. She built something instead. On her own terms. With cardamom and flour and the recipe of a man she had never stopped loving, and that kind of quiet courage, the kind that doesn't make the news and doesn't get photographed, is perhaps the rarest kind there is. Some love stories begin with fireworks. Some begin with silence. And some begin with a fog that finally starts to lift, slowly, imperfectly, without any guarantee of what the view will look like when it does. The only question that matters is, are you willing to keep the window open long enough to find out? And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Cassidy's place? When the man you had slowly, quietly, dangerously started to care about told you he was willing to change his entire life, would you have believed him? Or would you have done what she did, and stepped aside to let him find his way there without you as the reason? Because that is the hardest kind of love, isn't it? The kind that lets someone go not out of indifference, but out of the very specific and painful understanding that some journeys cannot be made for someone else's benefit. That healing has to begin in the right place, or it will not hold. And what about Adrian? He was admired by hundreds of thousands of people. He was covered by cameras wherever he went. He had the career, the house, the title, the recognition. And yet he sat alone at a window table every Thursday night, watching the rain. Does that make you feel anything? Because it does something to me every time I think about it. The idea that admiration, in enormous quantities, can still leave a person entirely alone. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever been surrounded by people who needed something from you, your competence, your strength, your performance of being all right, and felt, underneath all of it, completely unseen? If you have, then you already know exactly what Adrian felt. And I suspect more of you know that feeling than would comfortably admit it in public. Tell me in the comments. Tell me honestly. What would you have done? Who in this story do you understand the most? And is there a Cassidy in your life, someone who saw you clearly at a moment when you needed it most, who you never properly thanked? Because sometimes the greatest stories are not the ones that happen to famous people. They are the ones that happen quietly, in all our ordinary lives, in the corner tables of unremarkable restaurants on rainy Tuesday nights, between people who were brave enough to be honest with each other even when it was costly. Those stories deserve to be told too. If this story moved you, subscribe for more unforgettable stories about love, loss, redemption, and the truths people carry behind closed doors. Because the next story may stay with you even longer than this one. I'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Kindly hit the subscribe button and drop a comment and where you are watching from. Love you and see you soon.